My name is Eugene Wallace, but everyone calls me Gene. I'm 73 years old now, sitting in my Denver home, surrounded by thousands of books that have been my companions through a lifetime of searching for truth. The morning light filters through my study window, illuminating pages scattered with my handwriting, essays I'm still working on, questions I'm still trying to answer. People often ask me what drives a man to spend his entire life questioning everything, challenging the powerful, and fighting for what's right. The answer isn't simple. It's woven into every moment of my existence, from my first breath in 1952 to this very day when I still wake up burning with curiosity about the human condition. You see, I've lived through America's most transformative decades. I've watched our nation struggle with civil rights, Vietnam, corporate greed, and the constant battle between what's convenient and what's right. I've been a teacher, a writer, a husband, and most importantly, a man who refused to stay silent when silence would have been easier. At 47 years old, I published an article that changed my life forever. It questioned the ethics of America's biggest corporations, and suddenly, this small-town philosophy professor found himself at the center of a national conversation. But that moment of recognition was just one peak in a mountain range of experiences that shaped who I am today. My story isn't just about academic success or public recognition. It's about the power of asking difficult questions, the price of standing up for your principles, and the beautiful, messy complexity of a life lived with purpose. It's about love, loss, fear, courage, and the slow, sometimes painful process of growing into the person you're meant to be. If you're someone who's ever wondered whether one voice can make a difference, whether ideas have power, or whether it's worth fighting for truth in a world that often prefers comfortable lies, then I invite you to join me on this journey. Subscribe to hear the rest of my story, because I promise you, it's just getting started. This is the story of how a curious kid from Denver became a man who dared to challenge the giants of American business and lived to tell about it. I entered this world on a crisp October morning in 1952 in Denver, Colorado. My parents, Robert and Margaret Wallace, were simple people with extraordinary dreams for their son. Dad worked as a mechanic at the local Ford dealership, his hands permanently stained with grease and his mind sharp with practical wisdom. Mom was a school secretary who brought home stories about education that would plant the first seeds of my future calling. Our house on Maple Street was small, but filled with something precious: books. While other families spent their extra money on new appliances or fancy cars, my parents invested in knowledge. Every birthday, every Christmas, every good report card meant a new book added to our growing collection. By the time I was 10, I had read everything from Tom Sawyer to basic philosophy texts that most kids wouldn't touch until college. The 1950s were a time of supposed simplicity in America, but even as a child, I sensed the contradictions beneath the surface. We were taught that America was the land of the free, yet I saw how differently people were treated based on the color of their skin. We celebrated prosperity, but I watched neighbors struggle to put food on the table. These observations formed the foundation of my lifelong fascination with the gap between ideals and reality. School came easily to me, perhaps too easily. While other kids played baseball after school, I found myself drawn to the library, devouring books on history, science, and philosophy. Mrs. Henderson, my sixth-grade teacher, was the first person to tell me I had a gift for asking the kinds of questions that made adults uncomfortable. "Gene," she said one day after I challenged the textbook's oversimplified explanation of the Civil War, "you're going to either change the world or drive everyone crazy trying." My teenage years were marked by the cultural earthquake of the 1960s. While my classmates were discovering rock and roll and teenage rebellion, I was discovering Socrates, Plato, and the power of critical thinking. I wasn't antisocial. I had friends and even played on the debate team, but I was different. I was the kid who asked, why, when everyone else accepted, because the Vietnam War was raging, and young men my age were being drafted to fight in a conflict that many didn't understand. I watched as my older brother, Michael, was sent to Southeast Asia. He came back changed, quieter, haunted by things he couldn't or wouldn't talk about. His transformation taught me my first real lesson about the cost of unquestioned authority and the importance of examining the motives behind the decisions that shape our lives. High school graduation in 1970 felt like standing at the edge of a vast ocean. I had been accepted to the University of Colorado with a partial scholarship, thanks to my academic performance and a persuasive essay about the role of philosophy in modern society. My parents were proud but nervous. I would be the first Wallace to attend college, and they worried about whether our working-class roots would be enough to sustain me in an academic world. The night before I left for college, my father sat me down in his workshop. The smell of motor oil and steel shavings filled the air as he wiped his hands on a rag and looked at me with eyes full of wisdom and concern. "Son," he said, "you've got a mind that can take you anywhere you want to go. But remember, knowledge without compassion is just arrogance, and questions without courage to face the answers are just noise." Those words would guide me through the next phase of my life, as I stepped into a world that would challenge everything I thought I knew about truth, justice, and the American way. Walking onto the University of Colorado campus in Boulder in the fall of 1970 felt like entering a different universe. The air was electric with change. Students were protesting the war, questioning authority, and reimagining what America could become. For a small-town kid who had spent his childhood reading about philosophy, suddenly being surrounded by people who lived and breathed these ideas was intoxicating. My freshman year was a whirlwind of discovery. Professor David Kellerman, who taught Introduction to Philosophy, became my first real mentor. He was a man in his 50s who had studied at Harvard and had the rare gift of making ancient Greek philosophy feel as relevant as the morning news. "Mr. Wallace," he said after I'd spent an entire class period challenging Aristotle's views on democracy, "you have the mind of a natural philosopher, but philosophy without wisdom is dangerous. Are you wise enough to handle what you're learning?" That question haunted me for weeks. I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that worried my roommate, Tom Chun, a pre-med student from California who became my closest friend. While Tom dissected frogs and memorized anatomy, I dissected ideas and memorized the arguments of history's greatest thinkers. We would stay up until dawn, debating everything from the existence of God to the ethics of capitalism, fueled by black coffee and the arrogance of youth. The early 1970s were a time when the very foundations of American society seemed to be cracking. Watergate was unfolding, trust in government was at an all-time low, and young people like me were asking fundamental questions about authority, power, and truth. I found myself drawn particularly to moral philosophy and ethics, questions about right and wrong, about how societies should organize themselves, about what we owe to each other. During my sophomore year, I met Sarah Martinez in a comparative religion class. She was studying journalism and had a fire in her eyes that matched my own passion for truth. Our first conversation lasted 6 hours, covering everything from Nietzsche to nuclear war. She challenged my ideas as fiercely as I challenged hers. And for the first time in my life, I met someone who could match my intellectual curiosity with equal intensity. Sarah came from a family of Mexican immigrants who had built a successful restaurant business in Colorado Springs. Her parents had worked 18-hour days to give their children opportunities they'd never had, and she carried that work ethic and determination like a badge of honor. When she told me she wanted to be an investigative journalist who exposed corruption and held powerful people accountable, I knew I was falling in love with more than just her mind. My junior year brought a crisis that would shape the rest of my academic career. Professor Kellerman assigned us to write a paper examining the ethical implications of a current event. Most students chose safe topics: abortion rights, environmental protection, civil rights. I chose to examine the business practices of a major corporation that had significant interests in Colorado, Cynthia Industries, a manufacturing conglomerate that produced everything from household appliances to military equipment. What I discovered in my research shook me to my core. Through public records, newspaper reports, and interviews with former employees, I uncovered a pattern of environmental violations, worker safety negligence, and financial manipulation that painted a picture of corporate irresponsibility on a massive scale. My paper, titled "The Hidden Costs of Progress: An Ethical Analysis of Modern Corporate Behavior," was 50 pages of carefully documented evidence and moral argumentation. Professor Kellerman was impressed but concerned. "Gene," he said, "this is graduate-level work, but you're making some serious accusations here. Are you prepared for the consequences of publishing something like this? I wasn't sure what he meant until I submitted the paper to the university's undergraduate research journal. Within weeks, I received a call from a lawyer representing Cynthia Industries, politely but firmly suggesting that I might want to reconsider my speculative conclusions. The university administration, apparently after receiving some pressure, suggested that perhaps my paper was too ambitious for an undergraduate publication. But something had awakened in me during those months of research. I had discovered that ideas weren't just abstract concepts to be debated in classrooms. They were tools that could shine light into dark corners, weapons that could be used to fight injustice, bridges that could connect moral principles to real-world action. Sarah stood by me throughout the controversy, even when her own professors warned her that associating with troublemakers might hurt her journalism career. Together, we decided that if the university wouldn't publish my research, we'd find another way to get into the world. By my senior year, I had transformed from a curious student into someone with a mission. The experience with Cynthia Industries had taught me that the comfortable boundaries between academic philosophy and real-world action were often artificial barriers maintained by people who benefited from keeping difficult questions unasked. Sarah and I decided to start an underground campus newspaper called the Ethics Monitor. We scraped together money from part-time jobs, borrowed equipment from sympathetic journalism students, and launched what would become one of the most controversial publications in the university's history. Our mission statement was simple: to examine the ethical implications of decisions made by those in power, whether in government, business, or academia. Our first issue featured my expanded research on Cynthia Industries, along with Sarah's investigation into the university's investment portfolio, which included significant holdings in companies with questionable labor practices. We distributed it by hand around campus, leaving copies in dormitories, libraries, and student centers. The reaction was immediate and intense. Students lined up to get copies, professors debated our findings in their classes, and the administration called us in for what they termed a conversation about responsible journalism. The conversation was really a veiled threat. Continue this kind of reckless reporting, and our academic standing might be in jeopardy. But something unexpected happened. Letters began arriving from alumni, community members, and even some faculty expressing support for what we were doing. A retired economics professor, Dr. Amanda Rivers, became our unofficial advisor, teaching us about research methodology and helping us understand the complex financial structures we were investigating. What you're doing, Dr. Rivers told us one evening in her book-filled office, is exactly what education should accomplish. You're learning to think critically, to question authority, and to use knowledge as a tool for justice. Don't let anyone convince you that this isn't valuable. My relationship with Sarah deepened during these intense months. We weren't just collaborators anymore. We were partners in every sense of the word. She brought journalistic rigor to my philosophical idealism, while I helped her see the moral frameworks that could give context to the facts she uncovered. We complemented each other perfectly, and by the spring of my senior year, we both knew we wanted to build a life together. The culmination of my undergraduate years came with my senior thesis, a comprehensive examination of corporate ethics in post-war America. I had learned from my earlier experience to be more careful with my language, more thorough with my documentation, and more strategic about my approach. The thesis was 120 pages of carefully crafted argument that traced the evolution of business ethics from the 1940s to the 1970s, examining how the pursuit of profit had increasingly displaced concerns about social responsibility. Professor Kellerman, who served as my thesis advisor, called it a mature work of moral philosophy that demonstrates not just intellectual rigor, but moral courage. The thesis defense was standing room only, with students, faculty, and even some community members attending. For 2 hours, I fielded questions, defended my arguments, and engaged in the kind of scholarly debate that I had dreamed about since childhood. When the committee unanimously approved my thesis with highest honors, I felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond academic achievement. I had found my voice, and I knew how I wanted to use it. Graduation day, in May 1974, was bittersweet. I was leaving behind the protective environment of the university, where asking difficult questions was encouraged, and entering a world where such questions were often seen as threatening. Sarah had already been accepted to graduate school in journalism at Northwestern, and I had been offered a fellowship to pursue a PhD in philosophy at the University of Chicago. As we packed up our small apartment near campus, surrounded by boxes of books and back issues of the Ethics Monitor, Sarah asked me a question that would echo through the next phase of my life. Gene, what do you want to accomplish with all this knowledge you're accumulating? I thought about my father's words on the night before I left for college, about the gap between America's ideals and its reality, about the power of ideas to change the world. I want to teach, I said finally, but not just in classrooms. I want to teach people to ask the questions that need to be asked, to think critically about the world they're living in, to understand that philosophy isn't just an abstract exercise. It's a tool for building a better society. We both knew that the path ahead would be challenging, but we also knew that we had found not just our calling but each other. The foundation had been laid for everything that would follow. Graduate school at the University of Chicago was like being thrown into the deep end of an ocean filled with sharks. Brilliant, competitive, intimidating sharks who could quote Hegel in 3 languages and reduce your carefully constructed arguments to rubble with a single well-placed question. I thrived in that environment, even though it nearly broke me several times. My advisor, Professor Elizabeth Hartman, was a formidable woman who had studied under some of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century. She had little patience for sloppy thinking or moral grandstanding, and she pushed me harder than I had ever been pushed. Mr. Wallace, she said after decimating my first seminar presentation, passion is important, but precision is essential. If you want to change the world, you need to understand it first, and that requires intellectual humility as well as moral conviction. The distance from Sarah was harder than I had anticipated. We wrote letters constantly and talked on the phone when we could afford the long-distance charges, but the 400 miles between Chicago and Northwestern felt like an ocean. She was excelling in her journalism program, already working on investigations that were getting noticed by major newspapers. Meanwhile, I was spending 18 hours a day in the library, working on a dissertation about the intersection of moral philosophy and social policy. During my second year, I received news that shattered my world. My father had suffered a heart attack while working on a car in his shop. By the time the paramedics arrived, it was too late. Robert Wallace, the man who had taught me that knowledge without compassion was just arrogance, was gone at the age of 52. The funeral was the hardest thing I had ever endured. Standing beside his coffin, surrounded by the mechanics, neighbors, and friends whose lives he had touched, I realized that my father had been a philosopher in his own way. A man who understood that wisdom came not from books, but from treating people with dignity and doing honest work with integrity. Mom was devastated, but determined to carry on. Your father believed in what you're doing, Gene, she told me as we cleaned out his workshop. He may not have understood all those big ideas you talk about, but he knew they mattered to you, and that was enough for him. I threw myself back into my studies with renewed purpose, but something had changed. The abstract philosophical problems that had once fascinated me now seemed less important than the practical question of how ideas could improve real people's lives. My dissertation began to evolve from a purely theoretical exercise into an examination of how moral philosophy could inform public policy. Sarah and I were married in the summer of 1976 in a small ceremony at her parents' restaurant in Colorado Springs. It was a celebration of not just our love for each other, but our shared commitment to using our talents to make a difference in the world. Our honeymoon was a driving trip through the American West, visiting small towns and talking to people about their hopes, fears, and challenges. Those conversations would influence my thinking for years to come. I completed my PhD in 1977 with a dissertation titled The Moral Foundations of Democratic Governance, a framework for ethical policy analysis. It was accepted for publication by University of Chicago Press, my first book and a milestone that felt both thrilling and terrifying. The book argued that effective democracy required not just institutional structures, but a shared commitment to moral reasoning and ethical decision-making. The job market for philosophy PhDs was brutal, but I was fortunate to receive an offer from the University of Denver to join their philosophy department as an assistant professor. Sarah found work as a reporter for the Denver Post, covering city government and local business. We rented a small house near the campus, filled it with books and secondhand furniture, and began building the life we had dreamed about. Teaching was a revelation. Standing in front of a classroom full of undergraduates, many of them the same age I'd been when I first discovered philosophy. I felt the profound responsibility of shaping minds and inspiring critical thinking. I developed a teaching style that combined rigorous intellectual analysis with real-world applications, using current events and local issues to illustrate abstract philosophical principles. My students nicknamed me Professor Y because of my habit of responding to their questions with more questions. Don't just tell me what you think, I would say. Tell me why you think it, what evidence supports your position, and what might convince you to change your mind. By 1980, I had found my rhythm as a professor. My classes were popular with students who appreciated my approach of connecting philosophy to everyday life, though some colleagues viewed my methods with skepticism. Wallace makes philosophy seem too accessible, one senior professor complained. Students might get the impression that these ideas are simple. That criticism revealed exactly what I was trying to change about academic philosophy. I believed that moral reasoning and critical thinking were tools that everyone needed, not luxury items for intellectual elites. If philosophical ideas couldn't help ordinary people make better decisions and live better lives, then what was the point of studying them? Sarah was making her own mark at the Denver Post. Her investigations into city council corruption and questionable real estate deals had earned her recognition as one of Colorado's most promising young journalists. We made a good team. She would uncover facts through investigative reporting, and I would help her analyze the ethical implications of what she discovered. In 1982, we faced our first major personal crisis. Sarah had been trying to get pregnant for 2 years without success. The doctors couldn't find anything definitively wrong, but month after month brought disappointment. The strain affected both of our careers and our relationship. We considered adoption, fertility treatments, and even the possibility that we might never have children. During this difficult period, I found solace in a project that had been brewing for years, starting a book club that would bring together community members to discuss literature, philosophy, and ideas. The Denver Philosophical Society, as we eventually called it, began with 8 people meeting in our living room on Thursday evenings. The original members were a diverse group: Janet Morrison, a retired high school principal; Dr. Miguel Santos, a pediatric surgeon at Denver General; Rebecca Chun, Tom's sister, who worked as a social worker; Frank O'Brien, a union organizer; Lisa Martinez, a young lawyer; David Kim, who owned a small bookstore; and Father Michael Murphy, a Catholic priest with a PhD in theology. Sarah joined when her reporting schedule allowed. Our discussions were unlike anything I had experienced in academic settings. These were people grappling with real challenges: medical ethical dilemmas, questions of social justice, conflicts between personal values and professional obligations. They brought philosophical questions to life in ways that classroom debates never could. Dr. Santos, for example, was dealing with a case involving a terminally ill child whose parents wanted to pursue aggressive treatment that would likely cause more suffering without extending life meaningfully. "Gene," he said one evening, "all the medical ethics textbooks in the world can't tell me how to handle the look in that mother's eyes." These conversations changed how I taught. I began incorporating more case studies, more real-world dilemmas, more opportunities for students to grapple with the messy complexity of actual moral decision-making. My classes became laboratories for applied ethics, places where students learned not just what philosophers had thought, but how to think philosophically about their own lives and choices. The book club grew steadily, eventually moving to a larger space in David Kim's bookstore. Word spread through Denver's intellectual community about this unusual group where plumbers and professors, nurses and lawyers, students and retirees could engage as equals in serious discussions about life's biggest questions. By 1985, we had over 40 regular members and a waiting list. We had also caught the attention of local media. Sarah wrote a feature story about the group for the Post, and I was invited to speak on local radio shows about the role of philosophy in community life. The success of the Denver Philosophical Society taught me something important about the hunger for meaningful intellectual engagement that existed outside university walls. People were eager to think deeply about ethics, meaning, and purpose. They just needed the right environment and the right tools. It also taught me about the power of questions to build community. When people came together to explore fundamental questions about how to live, They discovered shared values and common ground that transcended their surface differences. Philosophy wasn't just an academic discipline. It was a practice that could strengthen the social fabric of democracy itself. The late 1980s brought new challenges and opportunities. I had been promoted to associate professor with tenure, which provided security, but also increased expectations for research and publication. Sarah had become one of Denver's most respected investigative reporters, known for her meticulous fact-checking and fearless pursuit of powerful figures who preferred to avoid scrutiny. The book club continued to flourish, and I had begun work on my second book, Philosophy for Citizens: How Critical Thinking Can Strengthen Democracy. The book was based on my experiences with the Denver Philosophical Society and my growing conviction that philosophical education needed to extend far beyond university campuses. But it was during this period that the seeds were planted for the most significant moment of my career. In 1988, Sarah was assigned to cover a story about environmental contamination at a manufacturing plant owned by Meridian Corporation, one of the largest conglomerates in the United States. The plant, located in a working-class neighborhood of Denver, had been discharging chemicals into the local water supply for years. As Sarah dug deeper into the story, she uncovered a pattern of environmental violations, cover-ups, and regulatory capture that extended far beyond this single plant. Meridian had used its political influence and financial resources to avoid accountability for practices that were harming communities across the country. "Gene," Sarah said one evening as we sat in our kitchen, surrounded by boxes of documents she had obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, "this is bigger than just environmental crime. This is about how corporations have learned to manipulate the entire system, regulatory agencies, local governments, even the media, to protect their profits at the expense of public health and safety." I began helping Sarah analyze the ethical dimensions of what she was uncovering. The case raised fundamental questions about corporate responsibility, the limits of capitalist enterprise, and the role of government in protecting citizens from powerful economic interests. As we worked together on the investigation, I found myself thinking back to my undergraduate research on Cynthia Industries and my father's simple wisdom about doing honest work. The more we learned about Meridian's practices, the more convinced I became that this wasn't just a story for the newspaper. It was a case study that demanded serious philosophical analysis. I began writing what would eventually become my most famous article. Working late into the night in my study, surrounded by the books that have been my companions for decades, I crafted a detailed ethical analysis of Meridian's business practices. I examined their decision-making processes through multiple philosophical frameworks, utilitarian calculations of costs and benefits, deontological questions about duty and rights, virtue ethics considerations about corporate character. The Corporate Veil: How American Business Learned to Privatize Profits and Socialize Costs, was a 15,000-word examination of the Meridian case that placed it within the broader context of American capitalism's evolution since World War II. I argued that corporations like Meridian had become what I called moral hazard machines, entities structured in ways that systematically incentivized unethical behavior while protecting decision-makers from accountability. The article was too long and too complex for most mainstream publications, but I knew it was important work. I submitted it to Philosophy and Public Affairs, one of the most prestigious academic journals in applied philosophy. The peer review process took 8 months, during which I refined and expanded my arguments based on feedback from anonymous reviewers. Meanwhile, Sarah's newspaper series on Meridian had created a sensation in Denver and attracted national attention. Her reporting had prompted federal investigations, congressional hearings, and a massive class action lawsuit by affected communities. She won a Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting in 1991, the proudest moment of my life up to that point. But I was still waiting to hear about my article. Academic publishing moved at a glacial pace compared to journalism, and I was beginning to wonder if my work would ever see the light of day. Then, in March 1999, I received the call that would change everything. "Professor Wallace, this is Dr. Amanda Richardson from Philosophy and Public Affairs. We're delighted to inform you that your article has been accepted for publication. Moreover, we've received an unusual amount of interest in it from our editorial board and outside reviewers. We'd like to feature it as the lead article in our summer issue, and we're recommending it for several awards." The summer of 1999 was unlike anything I had experienced in my academic career. The Corporate Veil was published in the June issue of Philosophy and Public Affairs and immediately sparked intense debate within academic circles. But what happened next took me completely by surprise. The article caught the attention of Marcus Webb, a senior editor at The Atlantic Monthly, who called me on a Tuesday morning in July. "Professor Wallace," he said, "I've read your piece on corporate ethics, and I think it deserves a much wider audience than academic philosophy journals typically reach. Would you be interested in writing a shorter version for our general readership?" The idea of translating my academic work for a popular audience was both exciting and terrifying. I had spent my career writing for other philosophers, using the specialized language and complex argumentation that academic journals expected. Writing for The Atlantic would require me to make the same points in language that ordinary citizens could understand and appreciate. Sarah encouraged me to take the challenge. "Gene, this is exactly what you've been working toward, using philosophical analysis to help people understand important issues. The Denver Philosophical Society has been your laboratory for this kind of communication. You know how to do this." I spent 6 weeks that summer crafting a 4,000-word version of my argument for The Atlantic. I kept the philosophical rigor but eliminated the academic jargon, using concrete examples and accessible language to explain complex ethical concepts. The article, retitled "The Ethical Blind Spot: How Corporations Learn to Ignore Their Moral Obligations," was scheduled for the October issue. When the magazine hit newsstands, my phone started ringing and didn't stop for weeks. Reporters from major newspapers wanted interviews. Television producers invited me to appear on news programs. Think tanks and policy organizations requested copies of both versions of my article. The response was unprecedented for an academic philosopher. The New York Times ran an editorial praising my analysis. The Washington Post featured my work in their Sunday opinions section. Business magazines criticized my arguments, while environmental and labor organizations hailed them as breakthrough insights. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. Senator Patricia Collins of California, chair of the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, invited me to testify at hearings on corporate accountability that were scheduled for November. Standing in the ornate hearing room in the Hart Senate office building, facing a panel of senators and a gallery packed with corporate lawyers, journalists, and activists, I felt the weight of everything I had learned and believed pressing down on my shoulders. This was the moment when abstract philosophical arguments would either prove their worth in the real world or reveal their limitations. For 2 hours, I answered questions about corporate ethics, regulatory frameworks, and the moral obligations of business enterprises. I explained how philosophical analysis could provide tools for understanding and addressing the systematic problems that traditional approaches had failed to solve. Senator Collins asked the question that would later appear in dozens of news articles. "Professor Wallace, you're suggesting that our current corporate structure is inherently unethical. Are you calling for the end of capitalism as we know it?" "Senator," I replied, "I'm calling for capitalism to live up to its own moral claims. Free market systems are supposed to align private interests with public good. When corporations can systematically externalize costs while privatizing benefits, the system isn't working as designed. We need structural changes that restore the moral accountability that makes capitalism compatible with democracy." The hearing was covered extensively in national media. Time magazine included me in their year-end list of people who mattered. The American Philosophical Association invited me to deliver the keynote address at their annual convention. But perhaps more importantly, the article sparked conversations in book clubs, classrooms, and communities across the country. I received hundreds of letters from people who said my work had helped them understand their own experiences with corporate power and given them vocabulary for expressing their concerns. The Denver Philosophical Society organized a special session to discuss the article and its implications. The room was packed with longtime members and newcomers who had heard about our group through the media coverage. The discussion lasted 4 hours and ranged from specific policy recommendations to fundamental questions about the nature of economic justice. The years following the publication of The Corporate Veil brought opportunities and challenges I had never imagined. I became a sought-after speaker at universities, conferences, in public forums across the country. My third book, Moral Markets: Reimagining Capitalism for the Common Good, became a bestseller and was translated into 12 languages. Sarah and I, now in our 50s, had built a rich life together despite never having children. We had channeled our nurturing instincts into our work, her journalism, my teaching, and our shared commitment to the book club, which had become a Denver institution. We often joked that we had hundreds of intellectual children and the students and community members whose thinking we had helped shape. The recognition brought by my work also brought criticism. Conservative think tanks funded studies attempting to refute my arguments. Business organizations questioned my qualifications to analyze economic systems. Some academic colleagues suggested I had sold out by writing for popular audiences. But the criticism was far outweighed by the evidence that ideas could indeed make a difference. Corporate executives began citing my work in discussions about business ethics. Several major companies restructured their decision-making processes to include ethical review boards. Law schools added courses on corporate moral responsibility to their curricula. In 2005, I was elected president of the American Philosophical Association, becoming the first philosopher known primarily for applied ethics to hold the position. My presidential address, Philosophy as Public Service, argued that academic philosophers had a moral obligation to make their work accessible and relevant to broader public discourse. The Denver Philosophical Society celebrated its 25th anniversary in 2007 with a conference that drew participants from across the United States and several foreign countries. Seeing the connections that had formed, the friendships that had developed, and the influence that our little group had exercised, I felt a satisfaction deeper than any professional achievement. Sarah retired from active journalism in 2010, but continued writing books and mentoring young reporters. I stepped down from regular teaching in 2012, but remained active in research and writing. We traveled extensively, visiting philosophy programs and civic organizations in other countries, always learning about different approaches to the questions that had driven our careers. My mother lived until 2015, dying peacefully at the age of 91. In her final years, she often told people that she was proud of me not for the recognition I had received, but for staying true to the values she and my father had taught me. Gene never forgot where he came from, she would say, and he never stopped asking the questions that needed to be asked. The book club continues to meet every Thursday evening, now in its 4th decade of existence. Many of the original members have passed away, but new voices have joined the conversation. The discussions remain as passionate and meaningful as they were in our living room in 1982. Looking back on my career, I realized that my most important contribution wasn't any single article or book, but the example of how philosophical thinking could be brought to bear on practical problems. I helped demonstrate that abstract ideas about ethics, justice, and human nature weren't just academic luxuries, but essential tools for navigating the complexities of modern life. As I sit in my study today, surrounded by the books that have been my companions for more than 7 decades, I'm struck by how much and how little has changed since that young man first walked onto the University of Colorado campus in 1970. The questions I was asking then, about power, justice, responsibility, and the good life, remain as urgent and complex as ever. Corporate power has only grown since I wrote The Corporate Veil, but so has public awareness of the need for ethical accountability. Environmental challenges have intensified, but so has the sophistication of our moral reasoning about sustainability and intergenerational justice. Democracy faces new threats, but also new opportunities for citizen engagement and civic education. The lesson I've learned from 50 years of philosophical reflection is simple but profound. Questions are more powerful than answers. The moment we stop asking why things are the way they are, who benefits from current arrangements, and what alternatives might be possible, we begin to surrender our capacity for moral agency. I encourage everyone reading this to find their own version of the Denver Philosophical Society, a community where serious questions can be explored with others who care about living thoughtfully and ethically. Start a book club, join a discussion group, or simply commit to having deeper conversations with the people in your life. The future of our democracy depends not on experts or leaders, but on ordinary citizens who are willing to think critically, question authority, and engage with the moral complexity of the world we share. Philosophy isn't a luxury for academic elites. It's a birthright for anyone who wants to live an examined life and contribute to the common good. That boy who asked too many questions in sixth grade never stopped asking them. And in the end, that curiosity became his greatest gift to the world. The questions we ask define who we become, and the courage to pursue difficult answers shapes the legacy we leave behind. Today, at 73, I'm still writing, still questioning, still believing that one voice raised in thoughtful dissent can echo through eternity and change the world in ways we may never fully understand.